It is my privilege to pay tribute to one of the most illustrious intellectual explorers in the history of our university and of the American Academy. Today, we honor the extraordinary life and the enduring legacy of USC's first Nobel laureate, distinguished professor, George Olah. Though the loss of this particular scientist weighs heavily in our hearts, our spirits soar when we remember his lasting influence and impact. Long before we engaged in an extensive effort to recruit transformative faculty, it was George Olah who truly transformed the USC community. The moment he came to our campus, there was an academic awakening, a seismic shift that signaled our emergence as a world-class research university. For 4 decades, we were the benefactors of his brilliance, graced by his great genius, enlightened by the immensity of his intellect. And George always would give credit to Zora Caprillion, who recruited him to come to USC in the late 1970s. If you were to create a monument to the greatest minds in chemistry over the last half-century, George Olah's likeness would surely be there. The moment you met him, you realized he wasn't like everyone else. George didn't just have thoughts. He had incredible leaps of imagination, extraordinary flashes of insight, and astonishing amounts of ambition. In a field crowded with a constellation of renowned researchers, he was the star that outshined them all. He was an intellectual adventurer who bravely ventured into the vast unknown. He was guided by the compass of curiosity, and his vision allowed him to see worlds of wonder that remain hidden to most of humanity. In some ways, George Olah seemed like he had stepped out of another era. Often dressed sharply in a jacket and tie, he carried himself with an air of dignity and formality, and yes, magnanimity. He was an imposing figure, standing head and shoulders above the crowd, commanding a room or a meeting with his powerful presence and his booming baritone. He was frank, straight, and forthright, standing strongly by the courage of his convictions, always eager to express his ideas and his opinions. And yet, he was always the true gentleman, asking the right questions about the wife or the husband or the children before diving into deeper discussions about his favorite field. In 1994, as you all know, when he was summoned to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, we were all thrilled he had earned international recognition for the work that he did here at USC. On that day, the prestige of our university burned brighter, and the bar of expectations was raised even higher. As the spotlight shined on this singular individual honor, he was quick to credit the many colleagues whose creative collaborations helped bring his vision to life. In this way, he earned the lasting loyalty of those who revered him as a mentor and as a teacher, including people like Professor Surya Prakash, who started as a graduate student and served on his talented team for more than 4 decades. After receiving what many would have considered the crowning achievement of a career, George Olah could have basked in the glory and rested on his laurels. But his rare and restless intellect fueled his drive to explore new avenues of discovery. Propelled by the patronage of the legendary Loker family, he made their institute the center of the university for hydrocarbon chemistry. We watched with wonder as he acted as the architect for a visionary methanol economy, laying the groundwork for new innovations and new technologies promoting energy independence. We witnessed him building bridges of collaboration between basic research and practical solutions, meeting with companies and countries to find ways to free us from our deep dependence on fossil fuels. We admired his ability to recruit top talent to the Loker Hydrocarbon Research Institute and to use his influence to invite the best chemists from around the world to visit our campus and lecture at the University of Southern California. And right up until the end, his endless energy kept him publishing papers and teaching students. On his purest pleasures, was sharing his wealth of wisdom with the students who were privileged to have him as a professor. To hear him speak of the mystery and the history of chemistry was to witness the breathtaking beauty of a world that few of us will ever know or completely comprehend. Rarely referring to any notes, his lyrical lectures wove together complex concepts with interesting anecdotes about the greatest minds in chemistry, almost all of whom were his peers and personal acquaintances. Because he held himself and his students to incredibly high standards, he had the satisfaction of watching many of them later become his colleagues, pursuing prominent careers in the academy or in industry. We all know about George's great wisdom, but many of us remember he also had a great sense of humor. So the story I will share with you, I have many, but I will share only one with you, is that it was in 2006. I was the provost of the university at the time, and he called to invite me to the 50th year anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, where he invited the photographer who took the photos when the Soviet tanks were invading Hungary and Budapest to exhibit those photos at the Doheny Library. And I remember it was one Sunday afternoon where I came with my wife. We spent pretty much the whole afternoon, and there were some speeches also, so we stayed through the evening. And George was very grateful that I went out of my way to come to this event. The next morning, actually during lunch, I ran into him at the faculty center. And again, he wanted to thank me for coming to the event the day before. And I said, George, I want you to know one thing. I can really identify with you, with your family. My wife and I, we also went through a similar experience. Our families became refugees. I can understand what you went through. And so it was very special for me to participate in that event. And then he looked at me and he said, yes, Max, but for you and me, things really worked out. And I never forgot that. So he had such a strong passion for chemistry that he often talked about how much biology should be involved in the field of chemistry. When one of his graduate students chose to pursue biology after receiving his PhD, George remained very supportive. Years later, the graduate student was recruited as one of our top faculty members. Upon his return, George welcomed him with his dry sense of humor, telling him how thrilled he was that he was returning to USC after all these years, even if it meant bringing more biology to our university. If George Olah was the guiding force behind groundbreaking chemistry at USC, his wife, Judy, was the guiding light who shined the way to his success. He first met her during a summer vacation, an event he would later describe as the happiest moment of his life. For nearly 70 years, George's love of chemistry was enriched by the love of his life. At every step along the way, she was with him, side by side. She studied chemistry herself, joined the research team, and became beloved by her own family, as well as the Institute's extended family of students and researchers who were touched and transformed by their special partnership. So while we share the sadness of Judy and the entire Olah family, we know George will always live on in our minds and in our memories. His ideas and his innovations will be carried on by his colleagues in the field of chemistry. His influence will live on through the faculty he recruited and the students he inspired and mentored over the past several decades. His incredible accomplishments will live on in the halls of our history. George Olah may have been the first member of our faculty to receive the Nobel Prize, but the aura of his achievements have provided him with a legacy that will last forever. Thank you.
I regret that I never had the chance to know George Olah personally, but I've known for some time of the tremendous influence that he had on our university and his extraordinary contribution to the field of chemistry. George's arrival at USC as a transformative faculty member was a turning point for USC Dornsife. He caught the attention of the Loker family, whose generous support allowed USC Dornsife to become a leader in groundbreaking hydrocarbon research. As USC's first Nobel laureate, he also turned a spotlight on our science faculty and foreshadowed the rise of USC as a powerhouse in scientific research. But George himself recognized that USC was already making this pivot, already growing in scientific influence. He was recruited here by the great chemist Sid Benson, who was a group leader on the Manhattan Project. Reputation, honors, and status were never as important to him as impact or individuals, and he recognized USC's scientific potential. George was a serious scholar who poured his heart into his research. He took a rigorous and methodical approach to science, but he was also a fearless explorer of the unknown. I understand that he often recounted a story from the post-war period when he enjoyed experimenting with highly dangerous chemicals, such as boron trifluoride and hydrogen fluoride. His supervisor and mentor didn't want those chemicals in the lab, so George was banished to a half-collapsed balcony with his experiments. Undaunted, he just made sure that the balcony was available throughout the Eastern European winter, so he built a cover and an exhaust system out there and carried on. I can't help but to find nobility in his persistence and inspiration in his desire to learn and discover. But as I tell the story as dean of the college, I must point out at this point, don't try this at home. Fortunately, he was always careful enough to return home safely to his beloved wife, Judy. And it seems that whenever speaking about George, we're almost always also speaking about Judy. She was not only his soulmate, but also his colleague, and a deeply appreciated presence in the lives of the students. Many of these students have mentioned how both of them were always there to share wisdom and guidance, not just on chemistry, but on the roller coaster of life, on passion, priorities, gratitude, and family. George was an extraordinary scientific leader, and someone whose scientific reach extends far beyond his own research. Over 6 decades, he trained almost 300 young researchers, many of whom have gone on to become acclaimed scientists in their own right. He wrote often about his appreciation for his mentors in Hungary and their guidance when he was finding his own path. And he was proud of being part of a lineage of excellence. George's mentor, Dr. Zemplin, worked under Emil Fischer, who was honored in 1902 with the second ever Nobel Prize in chemistry. George was proud to point out that he was a scientific grandson of Fischer. I don't think there's anything more important in sustaining scientific progress than the opportunity to train with great scientists as a student or postdoctoral researcher. George's influence as this kind of leader will continue to be present in great scholarship and in success going forward. Many of the tributes that have come in mention that he was among the last titans of chemistry from the old guard. This may be true, but his fundamental approach to research, his liberal arts mindset, and his collaborative spirit was anything but old. This is exactly what we are trying to teach our students today. He was perhaps ahead of his time, consistently venturing into new fields, crossing disciplinary boundaries, and approaching some of the most complex problems of the day. He was applying diverse techniques and technologies to his research, and he was reaching out to colleagues abroad, always adamant that science is a global endeavor. George Olah will always be remembered at USC Dornsife as a consummate and prolific scholar. As we turn our thoughts today to his extraordinary life, we can take comfort in the fact that he was always looking to the future, our children's future, our planet's future. This is a legacy that reflects his brilliant mind and his generous nature. I'm sure that he would be touched by so many of his colleagues being here today to honor his memory. But to honor him properly, I'm also sure that he would insist that you pursue your work with the same rigor and joy that he did. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. George Olah and I knew each other for almost 43 years. I joined his group in Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1974 as a 20-year-old graduate student, and it seems like I have never left. George and I had a wonderful scientific journey together. Losing George was like losing my own father second time. George and Judy were like my own parents. Judy, as it was mentioned, is a great chemist in her own right, and she took care of us in the laboratory. By the early 1970s, George Olah was already a very well-known physical organic chemist with significant scientific achievements. In 1977, George was recruited to USC by the foresighted executive VP, Zohrab Kapralian, who wanted to create several centers of research excellence at USC. One such topic identified was the area of hydrocarbon chemistry. Zohrab managed to recruit both George Olah and, as it was mentioned, Sidney Benson, a well-known physical chemist, towards this endeavor. I moved with George to USC and obtained my PhD degree in 1978. At USC, George was introduced to then legal vice president, Carl Franklin, a great Trojan and a fundraiser extraordinaire. He in turn introduced George to Donald and Catherine Loker. They were so impressed with George that they decided to provide the necessary financial support to construct the Loker Institute building in 1979. George had the uncanny ability to articulate the importance of his research in very simple terms. He cultivated donors and developed lifelong friendships with them over a period of 2 decades. Additional major gifts to the Institute came from Carl Franklin, Catherine Loker, Harold and Tom Moulton, Eva Elkins, and many others that eventually resulted in 43,000 square feet of state-of-art laboratory and office space, the renovated Loker Hydrocarbon Research Institute, with its new Catherine Bogdanovich Loker wing. The Institute has also benefited from the financial support from many nonprofit foundations, governmental and industrial sources over the years. After moving to USC, George continues his productive and prolific research career with much vigor, which I am so proud to be part of. His work on superacids and carbocations led to USC's first ever Nobel Prize in October of 1994. What a memorable October day it was at USC campus, with all the newspapers and the TV channels chasing us for quotes. That year, I invested in my own tuxedo to accompany George to many memorable events, including the Nobel ceremony in Stockholm and a trip to the White House in Washington, D.C. Apart from his own family members, George also invited Catherine Loker, Carl Franklin, and Peter Stang, who was in the audience, to join the Nobel ceremony. As it was already mentioned, George did not sit on his past laurels after his Nobel. I was privileged to work with George on a hugely consequential problem facing humankind related to the anthropogenic carbon emissions and global warming. In the methanol economy group of concepts and technologies, we came up with the solutions for this carbon conundrum. You see, methanol is a 1 carbon-containing alcohol with a clean-burning drop-in fuel that can replace gasoline and diesel, and also a superior feedstock for all petrochemicals now produced from fossil fuels. For the past 27 years, the Loker Institute has worked on many aspects of this approach that led to the development of methanol fuel cells, several carbon dioxide capture technologies from point sources, including the air, and conversion of carbon dioxide to methanol using alternative energies. In fact, the latter is utilized to produce methanol employing geothermal energy from carbon dioxide and water in Iceland. The plant is aptly named the George Olah renewable methanol plant. One of the proudest moments of my life is sharing with George the inaugural Eric and Shaila Sampson Prime Minister's Prize for the Innovation in Alternative Fuels for Transportation from the State of Israel in 2013. The methanol economy is increasingly adopted in countries like China, Sweden, Israel, and Iran. The Loker Institute established by George has blossomed into a world-renowned center for energy and sustainability research. Over the past 40 years, many students, postdocs, faculty, and staff have contributed to these lasting achievements of the Institute. Some of them are here today to celebrate the extraordinary life of George Olah. The Loker Institute has also benefited from USC's steadfast support of the Institute and the strong advisory board, and many of the advisory board members are also here, and we are extremely grateful to them. After George decided to work full-time on the further development of the methanol economy, USC appointed me to run the Institute. George became a founding director, and he always quipped, "Surya, I'm only a founding director, not a funding director." So don't expect major donations from me. Joke aside, George was a financial supporter of USC, unconditionally loyal to USC and the Loker Institute, and was a true Trojan at heart. George was also a dedicated family man who was married to Judy for 68 years. He was very proud of his sons, George Jr., Ronnie, and their families who are all here. I am convinced that history will judge George as one of the greatest scientists of our time, and his many seminal contributions to chemistry will have a lasting impact on science. George was a visionary and worked hard for what he believed in. What some chemists believed to be only elusive reaction intermediates, he had managed to isolate and study. At his 80th birthday celebration, one of my colleagues, Chi Mac, aptly described George as follows: "He had the audacity to imagine the unimaginable, think the unthinkable, and dream the impossible." George was not only a great chemist, but also a kind and generous mentor who believed in the global nature of science. His research group was a mini United Nations. George, wherever you are, thanks for all that you have done for us. You have touched so many lives. You will be deeply missed, but your scientific legacy will continue at the Loker Institute for years to come. Thank you.
Professor Olah, Surya Prakash, and I have been leading the Loker Institute together for the past 27 years. George was my boss, my mentor, my trusted friend. I miss him dearly. Most of you know Professor Olah as the Nobel Laureate, a giant of a chemist, a leader, a recipient of numerous coveted awards whose legacy is firmly imprinted in college chemistry textbooks all over the world. He was also an exceptionally caring human being with a great sense of humor and an infectious laugh. At times, he could be the nerdiest of chemists, tinkering with the abstract. At other times, an effortless schmoozer, a charmer, securing multi-million-dollar endowments to benefit the institute that he started at USC some 40 years ago. George was fiercely loyal. I'm certain that my own experience is echoed in the story of many of his students and postdocs, his many disciples around the world. George was always ready to write you a letter of support, go to bat for you, give you advice, fight for your promotion, even years after you had left his group. Throughout his career, Dr. Olah understood the importance of well-funded, organized research units. As you know, there are many excellent chemists in the world. George was not only that, but a visionary leader who created an enduring framework, the Loker Institute, to carry out the science. George was also an immensely successful fundraiser, a rainmaker, if you will. The lasting friendship he forged with Don and Catherine Loker, Carl Franklin, and the Moultons are testaments to his extraordinary ability to inspire. George was a very intuitive person. He had a special ability to predict outcomes. His many hypotheses have been proven to be correct by our group's work and also by the discoveries of many, many others. He has taught us so much. His door was always open to anyone, but that didn't necessarily come with a free pass. George could be impatient and even intimidating sometimes, but he liked a challenge and valued contrarian opinions and continued to mull over them long after you have left the room. He had no problem changing his mind because he was forever the student. A quick study, as if saying, tell me more, tell me something I don't know. In smaller settings, George loved to hold court. He was a captivating storyteller. He also liked, one may say obsessively, to put things in context. For those of you who knew him well, this will bring back some memories. Regardless of how many times you have heard the story before, George will insist on including his newest argument or a big ask in context. And every time he would start the story from the beginning. And I mean the very beginning. It would go like this. At first, there was chaos. On the first day, God created, and so on. Consider this. Dr. Olah was 67 when he won the Nobel Prize. His legacy was firmly established by then. He had fundamentally changed the way we think about chemical reactions. Many of his contemporaries would have retired to an ocean view, world travel, or umbrella drinks by the pool. But not George. There was so much more to do. He himself reflected on his post-Nobel work on the methanol economy as just as important contribution to science as his earlier work with superacid, carbocations, or superelectrophiles. If you are looking to measure the impact of his post-Nobel discoveries, think of this. China has built an entire industry based on his vision and technologies. Today, methanol constitutes a whopping 10% of China's total volume of transportation fuel. And in Iceland, A renewable methanol plant is named after him. His book, The Methanol Economy, with co-authors Prakash and Gopert, is a scientific bestseller. Our weekly group meetings with him will stay with me forever. In these meetings, George inspired many generations of students. He would spice up his stories with recollections of notable chemists and his personal interactions with them. He loved to tell stories about Weinstein and H.C. Brown and the classical, non-classical ion controversy, and remind you how he won it. In no small measures, those weekly encounters with him shaped me to be the person that I am today. And I venture to say that if you talk to any of his students, they too will remember them fondly. We were extremely fortunate to be in his presence. We will miss him dearly. Thank you.
My husband Robin and I are honored to be here today to celebrate the life of someone who represented such a presence in all of our lives, and perhaps more importantly, in the lives of future generations. Dr. George Olah was someone very special to the Loker family. When my father and mother, Don and Catherine, decided to dedicate funds to the Hydrocarbon Research Institute, they were impressed by George's academic prestige, his scientific accomplishments, and most certainly by his Hungarian charm. And as it turned out, their instincts at seeking out funding a worthwhile cause were spot on. Over the years, the Loker Hydrocarbon Institute has come to be recognized worldwide for the research and discoveries made by Dr. Olah and his team of accomplished and innovative scientists. Eventually, with the creative energy of the Institute bursting at the seams, my mother applied her own version of the scientific method. She responded with an expansion of the Loker Hydrocarbon Institute building complex, including state-of-the-art laboratories, instrument facilities, and the George and Judith Olah Library. I will never forget how excited my mother was when she had the privilege of being invited to the ceremony held in Stockholm in 1994, honoring Dr. Olah with the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Family inclusion was always primordial to Dr. Olah, and on that day, my mom was included in the select list of family and friends to attend the occasion. And believe me, my mother reminded me about that glorious experience for years after. The other day, I read through George's acceptance speech and was moved by his recognition of and respect towards his scientific family as expressed in the following quote. Although receiving the Nobel Prize is the greatest satisfaction any scientist can experience, I consider it not only a personal acknowledgement, but also that of all my students, associates, and colleagues whose dedicated work over the years allowed my field of chemistry, which is not frequently highlighted in public, to be recognized. George never forgot about the importance of teamwork. My family, along with his family of colleagues at the Loker Hydrocarbon Institute, will certainly never forget about him. In Hungarian, give me a break here, Köszönöm, Gyuri. In English, thank you, George, for all your contributions to our lives. I just want to add one more thing here. Earth Day is this coming Friday, and there will be the March for Science, which will take place in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, all over the nation. And this will be a call to action to celebrate and defend the crucial role science plays in society and policy, and will bring attention to the importance of continuing and advancing scientific research in the United States. And inasmuch as the scientists of the Loker Hydrocarbon Institute are such stellar examples of this work, I brought along some t-shirts for them to wear on that day. The quest for science to make this planet safer and cleaner, a cleaner place, shall continue on at the Loker Hydrocarbon Institute, just as George had wished. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank President Nikias and USC for organizing my father's memorial. Max was my father's friend for over 25 years. I want to thank the Loker, Moulton, and Franklin families for their believing and supporting in my dad's vision. It was so wonderful that Catherine Loker and Carl Franklin accompanied my father with our family to Stockholm back in 1994. I want to recognize my mother, Judy Olah. She supported my dad for 73 years and made it easy for him to devote himself to his research. She earned a master's degree in chemistry so that she could understand what he was doing. Actually, he put a gun to her head and told her, "Judy, you've got to get a master's degree." True, true. While raising two small sons, she used a manual Olivetti typewriter to type up my dad's 4-volume tome, Friedel Crafts Chemistry. After my brother and I were somewhat grown up, she rejoined my father and worked in the lab doing NMR spectroscopy. After moving to Los Angeles, she worked alongside him at USC and also took care of all home and financial matters. And even after she retired, or so-called retired in the late 90s, she still accompanied my father at all times when he came in here to the Institute. Thank you so much, Mom. I want to recognize our family members who have made long journeys to be here with us today. My cousin John Olah and his wife Annie from Toronto, my aunt Kati Gross, and Andrea Steiner, my cousin, and her son Mitchell, and last but not least, my 94-year-old mother-in-law who drove down, Marjorie Smith, who drove down here from San Francisco with my brother-in-law, Brad. Today I want to talk about George Olah, the husband, father, grandfather, and son, rather than George Olah, the world-renowned chemist. The joke around my parents' house was that Dad's priorities were always chemistry, followed by chemistry, and then my mom, and then Ronnie and I. Nothing could have been further from the truth. He always put his family first. During World War II, at the age of 17, he saved his parents' lives by arranging for them to be hidden. After the war, he volunteered to go into bombed-out buildings to excavate bodies so they could get proper burials. Sorry. He earned his PhD at the age of 22. At 22, I was still on the 5-year plan trying to get my undergraduate degree. In 1956, true. In 1956, after teaching at the Technical University of Budapest for 7 years, my parents decided to flee the communist regime in Hungary. My mother carried me on her back to the Austrian border, where my parents had to surrender all of their worldly goods in order for them to gain their freedom. We landed in Sarnia, Ontario. My grandmother was already living in Montreal, Quebec, and my Uncle John, Aunt Anne, my cousin John, and his brother Andy were living in Toronto. My dad would take me to the Dow Labs many weekends in Sarnia. I remember the stench of the labs and couldn't understand what he could possibly see in chemistry and decided early on that this was not for me. On summer weekends, we would go to Lake Huron with my dad's fellow emigre and colleague, Steve Kuhn. As a small child, I was afraid of the dark and thought there was a boogeyman hiding in the basement. Dad would hold me by the hand and show me that everything was okay. After spending a few years in Boston, we moved to Cleveland in 1966, and my dad returned to academia. He was instrumental in the merger between Case and Western Reserve universities. During his summer sabbaticals, the family had some great trips to Europe. My dad would ferry us around in the Swiss and Austrian Alps in a VW Beetle. He always wanted to look out at the scenery, but we all admonished him and told him, "Not you, Daddy." Dad always had my back, whether it was helping to get me into an exclusive private school in Cleveland, hiring an attorney to defend me in court on a littering violation where, in fact, I wasn't even the litterer, or bailing me out of 2 BMW Lemons that I had bought. Dad was always there for me. I always sought his advice, as I know many of you out there did as well. Speaking of my friend Mark, I'll never forget one evening when Dad came back from work, and he was recounting to me how Mark was racing him on the street, Mark in his go-kart, my dad in his VW Bug. Needless to say, my dad lost that race, and needless to say, my dad did not care very much for Mark. In 1977, my parents moved to Los Angeles. My dad was most excited about having a swimming pool. He called this an extension of his bathtub. My brother was going to school at Stanford, and I moved out here in 1978 after finishing school. Dad wanted the entire family around him, and my grandmother moved out here from Montreal as well. He loved California, and he especially loved USC and was grateful for the opportunity that it had given him. Dad did have some shortcomings. He was not handy. I don't think he went into the lab much after his Dow Chemical years. He had my mom and all of his postdocs do all the dirty work. If he needed a ceiling light changed, he would enlist me at 5'6" to change it. Recall, he was the inverse at 6'5". He was extremely challenged by driving. Once he set out for the China Lake Air Naval Station and ended up in Santa Barbara. He told me that the reason for that was that he preferred the coast to the desert, but I didn't believe him. While never having less than an A while he was either in high school or college, he ended up failing the written part of the California driving test. Once, he actually drove over a judge's son's foot. I kid you not. He also told my brother and I that we were bald because we didn't wear pajama tops while we were little. I kid you not. But Dad was always there for the family, including my cousins Andy and John, who had lost their father at a very young age. He loved to dispense advice to all of us. When he would repeat the same advice, I would always say, "Oh no, here comes lecture number 5 again." My son Peter and my dad were extremely close. I think Peter's the only member of the family to have ever read his book, The Methanol Economy. While Peter was attending USC, he would visit my parents every Wednesday, and they would set aside time to have lunch with him and discuss the matters of the world. He and my dad were both environmentally active and had many conversations about this. My dad went with Peter to an environmental conference, even though my dad was already struggling with his disease. Dad was my role model, not only his work ethic, but his strong moral center. He was the most honest and generous person I've ever known. He was the most intelligent human being I ever met, and his knowledge was not limited to chemistry. He had a great knowledge of history, and that was actually his major before changing it to chemistry. He was a voracious reader and could finish a thick book in one day. My dad never complained about his health, or should I say his lack of it. He survived stomach cancer, pemphigus, 2 knee transplants, and a hip replacement as well. When he was diagnosed with cancer 8 months ago, he tried to hide this from my mother. He was my hero through to the end. I miss him every day, and I miss him answering the phone and saying in his thick Hungarian accent, "Hi, Georgie Porgy," followed by a "Darling, how are you?" So in closing, thank you, Dad, for being such a great father.
Since my father's passing over 1 month ago, several images of him over the years have been rattling through my brain. I remember so clearly so many things about him, and I'd like to expand on a few words and images that sum up his influence on my life and maybe on yours. The first word is orator. I shy away from public speaking, and I trace this directly back to my father. Besides my mother, I'm probably the person that heard more of his talks over the years than anyone else. While my father never discouraged me from public speaking, I realized early on I could never hope to come close to his oratorial skills. As a child, I was dragged around the world on many of his sabbaticals, while I would immaturely complain that I'd rather be at home playing Little League. I would sit in the audience during his lectures with literal understanding of what he was saying, but his passion was evident. As an adult, I came to appreciate the grace and fluidity of his Hungarian accented booming voice as he could wax on eloquently without prepared remarks. I wish he were here today speaking to us, as he loved to share his knowledge and insight with others. The next word is safety. While I was always considered a mama's boy while growing up, it was my father I turned to whenever I had a problem. One of my first memories as a child was walking through a gorge in the Austrian Alps with my mother. Taking a turn, we came to a steep precipice without any guardrails. I quickly ran ahead to my father, and he held my hand tightly. And from then on, I always felt safe in his presence. While patience was not my father's greatest virtue, and he certainly did not suffer fools gladly, I can say unequivocally that in a crisis, he was always the voice of calm and reason in the room. Any problem I had, I felt he could answer, and I definitely feel less secure without him. The next word is Rose Bowl. No, I'm not talking about USC's successes over the years on New Year's Day, but rather the reason we're gathered here today and not in Cleveland, Ohio, or another locale with less hospitable weather. Every New Year's Day, I would watch the Rose Bowl game alongside my father when I was growing up, while he characteristically multitasked working on his chemistry. And every New Year's Day, I would ask him why we couldn't live in Southern California. My senior year in high school, I decided to attend college in California, and I think I finally wore him down, convincing him that a change in scenery would be invigorating for him physically and scientifically. Yes, I had ulterior motives, but he never regretted the move for a second, as he told me on more than one occasion, usually while taking his religious morning swim, especially in the winter months. The next word is Charlie Brown. I'm not talking about the famous Charles Schultz character, but rather the son of Nobel Prize-winning chemist Herbert Brown, Charles Brown, who followed in his father's footsteps and became a chemist. Unlike my mother, who my father famously, or maybe more accurately, notoriously enrolled in chemistry classes, my father never encouraged or discouraged me from being a chemist, nor did he ever encourage or discourage me from becoming a doctor. He would have been happy whatever career path I chose. On my own, I decided to become a chemistry major in college. It was during an organic chemistry seminar during my sophomore year at Stanford when the professor, turning to a new topic, wrote my last name in bold letters up on the chalkboard. That was the moment that I, unlike Charlie Brown, decided to pursue a different career. My father told me after that he was glad I did. Some parents cast a shadow so large that it would be imprudent for their children to follow in their footsteps. My father cast such a shadow. The next word is plane guy, not P-L-A-I-N, but P-L-A-N-E, like the airplane. I don't remember his name, and I've never met him, but every year for the last decades, my parents received a box of fresh fruit several times a year from a man my father sat next to on an airplane flight many years before. He did not know the young man before the flight, but my dad's several-hour conversation, or potentially lecture with him, had such a profound impact on the plane guy's life that he subsequently credited my father with having shaped the course of much of his professional life. My father was a role model who went out of his way to help others. His loyalty knew no bounds. Despite his stature, he was generous with his time, and his wisdom transcended science. He was a catalyst and an advocate for the careers of many people who knew him well, who barely knew him, or hardly knew him at all. Next words are old school. Now, I realize giving stock tips on an occasion like this may seem inappropriate, but I'm going to give one to you anyway. While my children look at me as technologically challenged, their grandfather was even more so, and overtly proud of it. My stock tip is this. I urge everyone in the room to sell their shares in Topps TM and Office Depot, the leading manufacturers of yellow legal pads, because the demand for them has dramatically decreased since my father's passing. In his honor, I first jotted down my remarks on one of them. He was old school, resisting much of modern technology, and could barely use his iPhone or his computer. but I challenge anyone to match his productivity using just a number 2 pencil and a bunch of yellow sheets of paper. Next is passion. While his physical health failed him the last years, his mental capacities never diminished. He would say to me that this was both a blessing and a curse. Always restless for new knowledge, never satisfied with past successes, and as curious as ever, he turned his attention during his late 80s to chemistry's role in exploring the origins of life in the universe. Up till his last days, he was still actively pursuing this latest passion and more enthusiastic about it than ever. He confided to me that he considered this work to be some of the most important work he had ever done. I truly believe in my heart that he is now continuing his research closer to the source. And lastly, our push pins. My father was the strongest man I ever knew. He accomplished more in his lifetime than 100 men could cumulatively hope to do in theirs. He dodged many bullets in his life, literally and figuratively, but his last illness was even too much for him to overcome. He was a giant of a man, no matter what measuring stick you used. Physically and mentally, obviously, but he also had a giant heart that he used to positively affect the lives of his family, friends, colleagues, and students. My father had 3 great loves during his life. The first, obviously, was my mother, who was his anchor for over 70 years, and without whom he would have accomplished little. Second was his family, and especially his grandchildren, to whom he was a doting grandfather whose pride in their accomplishments eclipsed his own. And third was academia, science, and his scientific family. At the end of his autobiography, my father asked for my mother's and the rest of our family's forgiveness because he believed his science took up too much of his time. We never forgave him because he never did anything that he needed to be forgiven for. Clearly, science was part of his DNA, and without it, he would have not been whole. I would be remiss not to convey how much my father appreciated his colleagues, co-workers, and the hundreds of students who worked with him over the years. I clearly remember that at all the ceremonies I attended over the years in his honor, and there were many, when someone was extolling his accomplishments, my father went out of his way to acknowledge his students' and co-workers' fundamental roles in his success. A Nobel Prize-winning chemist, reflecting back on his life, viewed his most notable successes not to be the prizes, prosperity, or notoriety that he achieved, but rather the collaborative relationships that he forged along the way. One of my father's most prized possessions, given to him by former students, was a map of the world fixed upon a corkboard with hundreds of embedded pushpins representing the countries of origin or states of his former graduate students and postdocs, many of whom are here today. For my father, success did not equate to fame, but rather his self-worth was measured by the positive impact his life had on others and the number of pushpins that he accumulated. On behalf of my mother, my family, my wife Cindy, my son Justin, who are here today, and my daughter Caitlin, who is heartbroken that she could not be here today because she's studying in Paris, I want to thank everyone for attending, and we are truly overwhelmed by your kind sentiments. And finally, I'd like to thank the organizers of the George Olah Celebration of Life event, the President's Office, the staff of the Office of Cultural Relations and the University events, and the staff of Dornsife events, Dornsife College of Letters and Arts and Sciences. Thank you.
sparrow is forgotten, in the raven God will feed, and the lily of the valley from his bounty hath its need. Then shall I not trust thee, Father, in thy mercy have a share, and through faith and prayer thy mother merit thy protecting care.
Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Trojans, thank you so much for coming today. The reception is open, and we have the opportunity to chat with the Olah family and also share more stories between us. George will always be alive in our minds because he touched every single one of us. Thank you. Thank you for coming.